we looked at that dynamic. We looked at that 2-hour dynamic and we looked at that 100-hour dynamic. And we saw that in the middle there is a case that's pretty easy to model and pretty easy to predict, which is based on just making power all the time. And that's sort of been the holy grail of renewable energy, is how do we get to a point where we're really doing 24 hours a day of green power without having to have backups.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoit Thanjan, so let's get into it. Hi, this is Benoit, your host of the Solar Maverick podcast. I'm really excited to have John Langus. He is the Chief Commercial Officer at Photon Vault, and they have an exciting technology that I was excited to learn about, and it's basically giving storage 24/7. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Benoit. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, definitely. As part of this whole energy transition that we're having, we're going to need a lot of different technologies to be able to hit the renewable energy and climate energy goals. And it's not just going to be solar PV and lithium ion storage. And I believe there's going to be a lot of other great innovation into other technology. I really was excited to learn about your technology that you're working on at Photon Volt. It would be great if you could tell our listeners, who we call Mavericks, about your company and what the technology is.
Yeah, I'd love to. We definitely consider ourselves Mavericks as well. So I feel like I'm in a good company here.
Your original Maverick and your founder and your team is a Maverick. I should say that. Definitely. And you listen to the podcast. So thank you for listening to the podcast. I'm excited that you brought, this to us to speak to our audience. And, thank you for your time. I know you're wearing a lot of hats and, running around. So
yeah, Photon Vault is a thermal energy storage technology company. So we're developing our own technology, and then we're leveraging that technology as developers to build projects. And so as a thermal energy storage technology, that means that we take in energy as heat, we store it as heat, and then we discharge it as electricity. So some other thermal folks, they'll take their heat and they just leave it as heat. They want to use it for industrial processes and stuff like that. We want the electricity to make electricity with.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting. I mean, because that's a key differentiator, using that heat, as you said. And can you talk about more about how, maybe if our audience is not familiar, the thermal storage technology?
Yes. So one of the great things about thermal technology is that your energy, the number of kilowatt hours, that scales independently of the power, the number of kilowatts. So with our system, all of our expensive stuff is to make the power. And so if we're making our basic module of 5 megawatts, most of the expense of that system is buying the machinery to make that amount of power. And so everything in our system with a moving part, we're just buying from other people. But then the hours, that comes from our actual innovation. So our patented bricks, where we put all the heat, our patented ice tanks, where we collect ice for a cold store. And then our cycle, our process for doing that is also patented. But those extra hours, because they're mainly ice and sand bricks, those we can do very cheaply. And so that's why we can start talking about doing these long duration systems that cycle, instead of 2 to 4 hours a day, cycle 8, 10, 16 hours a day, and can really start making a full 24-hour a day clean power contract possible in a way that people haven't really been thinking is going to be possible for 5 or 10 years still.
Yeah, definitely. That is actually really concise explanation into the technology, and then how you're able to provide those sort of longer term or duration PPAs. And I thought it was actually really helpful on your website. You kind of showing the charging and discharging. It's really easy to understand when seeing it kind of in a diagram as well. Because for me as well, from speaking to you, I'm learning as well about this proprietary technology that Photon Vault has.
Yeah, it's definitely been part of my journey as, one of the guys on the team that's not a technical person, is, translating the more complicated parts of the technology in a way that investors or possible partners in projects, that they can understand pretty easily. And so that diagram, I do think, does that well.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll have that in the notes of the podcast, obviously, Photon Volt's
Oh, cool.
website, and I feel like you're the educator, right? Because you're the business person, right? As you mentioned, you don't have a technical background, so then you have to communicate it to investors and other parties, right, to understand what you're doing.
Exactly.
Can you talk about, too? I thought it was pretty interesting that the project qualifies for the 45X domestic manufacturing credit under the IRA. And obviously, you guys are a US based company. So also the 10% domestic content adder. Like, how does that differentiate? Also help make, I would think that it lowers the cost significantly with those incentives to make it more,
Yeah,
as
it
you said.
really is quite powerful. So we were planning on, going into the market doing 4-hour systems because that's what people are doing in the market right now. But we knew that once markets started to develop for long energy storage, that we would be able to do those particularly well. What was surprising to us was seeing the rules get published in December by the IRS about how they were going to implement this 45X manufacturing tax credit. And, like you said, that's a credit that was part of the IRS specifically designed to encourage US manufacturing of new renewable energy technologies. So it turns out that we're the exact sort of thing that they're looking to promote, because by taking that tax credit, we realized that we would be able to do these sort of long duration systems now profitably and not have to wait 5 or 10 years. And what's great about it is, for an early stage company like ours, obviously everything is more expensive for our early projects while we're working out how to do them best, how we're working out relationships with vendors and partners and all of that sort of stuff. And so with the support from 45X, we can be profitable right out of the gate. And then and that can support us as we squeeze the costs out of our system. And so by the time that those supports expire in 2032, we think that we'll be able to continue doing these profitably without that support. And then, like you said, we realized when we were looking at the 45X credit that once we got past like 8 hours of storage, then most of our CapEx suddenly becomes our bricks and our ice tanks and our solar collectors. And so those are all going to be made in the United States. And so then all of a sudden, those long duration storage projects should qualify for the 10% domestic content adder on the ITC side too. So it's a really powerful combination where they've set it up where the 45X credit goes to the producer of the technology, goes to Photon Vault. And then when we sell our projects to a customer, that customer gets to take the ITC against the purchase price on their side. So it's really like helping to solve the problem from two different directions. And they didn't know anything about us, but we seem to be a technology that's right where they wanted to support. So we're excited to be able to take advantage.
Yeah, definitely. That's huge, especially as you mentioned in the early stage development, your costs are going to be a lot higher. So that's exciting to hear that these government incentives are supporting, new and innovative technology that will help the energy transition. Have you built a successful project to date?
Yeah, so we are early stage. We're pre-revenue. We raised over $3.5 million now, and part of what we used that money for was to build our prototype. So we have a complete end-to-end prototype in California. It's at our test facility in Clovis, which is nearby to Fresno, and that was, certainly super interesting and exciting part of these 2 years that we've had since we launched the company. This is a prototype that everything is built by hand. So as opposed to when we start building the projects at commercial scale, all of those things will be automated. The things will be manufactured offsite and then assembled on site. But for the prototype, this was Kent, some number of us from the team out with him on any given day building these things. So to give you a sense of scale, it's a 10 kilowatt prototype, but that includes a 50-foot long ice tank. That ice tank has about a mile of stainless steel tubing running through it. That stainless steel tubing is then filled with CO2. That's what we use to move energy around our system, is CO2. So that CO2 gets hot and it gets cold, makes ice, melts ice, but about a mile of that tubing. And then we made over 10,000 pounds of our bricks. And so that's two people with a press making these sand bricks. It takes about 25 minutes for two people to make a single brick that's about 30 pounds or so. And then once we're doing this for real, we'll have a machine making a 150-pound brick like every minute. So way different deal while we're doing it ourselves. And then we built 14 kilowatts of our solar thermal collectors. So we have just simple sit in the sun and get hot glass collectors that we buy from other people. But then we designed the enclosure for that, which is meant to reduce the cost and add to the efficiency of those collectors. So we've got a bunch of those arrayed out there as well.
Yeah, that is really interesting to hear about that. And I appreciate the detail too. And I know when we were speaking before, also it requires a certain amount of sunlight for the projects to be economical. And you were talking about that it's in the southwest of the US. Can you talk about why you need high solar irradiance to basically, because of it being solar thermal and
Yeah, that's a great question. So we basically have two basic designs for the system. So one, our key innovation for Photon Volt is that when we charge our system, we do that by taking both electricity and direct heat. And the reason that we do that is it's an economic driver of our business model. So electricity tends to be very valuable in the world. Heat, on the other hand, tends to be pretty cheap. It's even cheap to make. And it's really cheap to find it as a waste product, but it's even pretty cheap to make. So we take it on electricity. We drive a compressor with that makes our ice for our cold piece of our storage. And then we lose, about half of that energy. It's a refrigeration cycle, kind of operates like a heat pump if people are familiar with that sort of version of these projects. And so that's a big problem with energy storage, right? Is the efficiency losses when you're storing energy. You're always going to lose some basic law of thermodynamics. You're always going to lose energy in your system. So the way that we address that is by adding that second step of bringing in direct heat. And so we have cheap or free heat every day that replaces the energy that we lose in our electricity cycle. And so the result of that is that when we're ready to make electricity, by adding in all of this additional heat, we can make as much or more electricity at the end of the cycle as we brought in at the beginning of the cycle. This is one of the things that, as we started off explaining our technology, we would always drive into the ditch on this part. People would think we were crazy or a charlatan and that we didn't understand thermodynamics. And my PhD physicist leader, Kent McCormick, would have to explain, no, they haven't taken away my physics license. I understand thermodynamics. It's just math. We're just taking very valuable electricity and supplementing it with very cheap. So that heat, though, can come from different places. So our two basic designs are first to make that heat with these cheap solar thermal collectors. And that's what we think is really going to drive the growth of the company. For that, we don't need a host customer. We don't need anything but land, sun, and an interconnection to put into the grid. It can also be set up, though, as a microgrid. It can be set up to support dedicated facilities like green hydrogen, green ammonia, things like that. But you need that. So in the United States, that means the Southwest United States, Arizona, Nevada, Southern Utah, probably California, New Mexico, Southern Colorado, and West Texas. And then abroad, you can look at lots of places like those, right? North Africa, Middle East, Australia, Southern Africa, parts of China, a lot of South America. So any of those places where you can get some land and you can get some sun. But then we have another design that is you basically can take away all the solar thermal collectors. And that's where you have a waste heat source. So we can nestle up next to a factory or a steel mill or something like that. And we can take the heat that they're creating as a waste product and use that to heat our sand brick. And so there's a lot of benefits to that. It's higher temperature, so it's more efficient. It's a much smaller land footprint, so you can fit that into places that you couldn't fit our solar thermal design. And it helps those companies to decarbonize somewhat, right? Because they're spending a certain amount of CO2 emissions on the energy that they're using in their process. And so this gets more energy out of those sources of energy that they would otherwise be getting. So we like that case a lot. We expect the waste heat case to contribute a lot to our success over time. But the base case is just sitting out where it's sunny and getting our heat that way.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting and really helpful to know. And I'm sure, educating people about like how the whole thermal process works and then, not having more electricity afterwards than before, which is
Hmm.
conventional in lithium ion. I'm sure that's very difficult to explain to investors and the utility companies and other entities that are interested in learning about your technology. And I'm sure it's a challenge to explain for sure. And you probably need very technical people involved in the conversations from the other side to be able to move forward. It's interesting. You mentioned Kent, who's the founder of Photon Volt. Can you talk about like how he came up with this technology and his background as well?
Yeah, you bet. Kent's one of my oldest and best friends. So it was really fun to, have the opportunity to super fun to be starting a company that we think is going to be super impactful. But doing it with a really good friend of mine has been particularly fun. And so basically, when we grew up together, his folks owned a mechanical contracting company. And so when the rest of us were flipping burgers or stacking groceries for the summer, he would be sitting being a junior engineer at his parents' engineering company. And you can see that come through in part of the designs of the photon vault. In fact, our whole electricity piece of that charging process I was describing, like I said, it's a refrigeration cycle. There's a lot of concepts in that design that come out of the commercial HVAC industry. And that's sort of, stuff that he first started to learn about and get expert in Oklahoma way back in the 80s. And so then he went on to get his physics PhD from Berkeley, but he decided that he wanted to go into business rather than academia after doing that. So he started with getting some great business experience at McKinsey. He did some early tech experience, a company called EMC, which is part of Dell. And then he launched his own software company called Lattice Engines. He did that with a good friend and partner of his, who's now become an investor with us at Photon Vault. They built that company over more than 15 years. I think they were about $130 million a year company, something like that, when they sold it to Dun& Bradstreet a few years ago. So he had that successful run. That was based on software that he wrote. So that's another sort of skill set that he brings to us at Photon Vault that's separate from the physics. But he looked around and he wanted to go back to his roots as a scientist again. And in particular, he wanted to do something that was going to have a lasting impact on the world, that was going to make some sort of meaningful contribution to what he's leaving behind. And so he actually started on desalination. He lives in California, San Ramon, and obviously water scarcity is a concern for anywhere out west. And so he started looking into that, but very quickly realized that if you're doing desalination in California, well, you want to run that renewable energy, right? And so the problem with that is that you only have renewable energy about 8 hours a day from the solar. And so it's really hard to make a desalination plant profitable if you can only run it 8 hours a day. So you really need affordable energy storage. So with that recognition, he pivoted and started working on energy storage technology development. And so spent about almost 5 years before we launched the company commercially 2 years ago. He spent working on that basic technology, running down, wrong directions a lot of times before he came up with the things that work better. And then got 3 patents on the technology just before we launched.
As a leading authority in the solar industry, life gets very busy. In addition to traveling the world as a speaker and for my entrepreneurial ventures, I'm a son, friend, investor, and entrepreneur. And when it comes to delivering a great sounding show for my listeners, I choose Podcast Laundry. All I have to do is record and send, and the rest is done. They do the dirty work of podcasting for me. Yes, social media graphics, quotes, show notes, master editing, and much more. All I have to do is record. So if you're a busy podcaster like me with an engaged audience and want to free up your time to do more of what you love, like going to the gym or spending time with loved ones, go to podcastlaundry.com to schedule your consultation or call 347-871-8273. That's podcastlaundry.com or 347-871-8273.
That's exciting. And, Kent's obviously a maverick and done amazing things in the past and as well, had a successful exit. And that's great that he's gone back to his roots and something that we definitely need, like the most sophisticated minds to be able to figure out the energy transition. Kind of moving around a little bit on the questions, like, Photon Vault offers 20 to 7 or /7 firm clean power. Can you tell us like more about that? Because that's obviously something that's not there in the market and,
Mm-hmm.
would be great because of this technology. This is a key differentiator that this is the first time I've actually heard of a company able to do it. So it would be great for our audience, for Mavericks as well as you guys, to learn more about it.
Yeah, it's maybe the thing that we're most excited about right now with photon pulp. And so this was what came out of starting to think about long duration energy storage use cases when we saw the rules come out for 45 that we talked about before. And so what drives this for us is the combination of our technology being low cost but high efficiency. That benefit of being able to produce about as much power or more at the end of the cycle as we brought in. What that means is, so if you're trading a battery right now, 2 to 4 hours a day, it doesn't really matter what your efficiency is, because in the markets where we really need that short duration storage in California and Texas, you've got these huge daily almost peaks and valleys between the low cost of power in that market and the high cost of power in that market. So if you're in Texas and you can charge your battery like less than 2 cents a kilowatt hour for a while because the sun's out and the wind's blowing hard and power has gotten really cheap. And then several hours later, either the wind dies down unexpectedly or the sun goes down. All of a sudden, you can sell that power that you stored for maybe 10, 15, 20 cents a kilowatt hour. Then it doesn't really matter if your efficiency is not great because you're still going to make a lot of money for that. But when you start talking about long duration storage, you have to think about how often are you going to use that storage, right? So you build like a 100-hour storage system, and whether that makes money depends a whole lot on how often people are going to need it. So if you do 100-hour storage and you cycle that 20 times a year, you don't need to make nearly as much money per cycle as if they're only going to need it like 3 times a year, right? So that's the things about figuring out long duration storage is how can you plan on how often you're going to need it, right? So we looked at that dynamic. We looked at that 2 hour dynamic and we looked at that 100-hour dynamic. And we saw that in the middle there is a case that's pretty easy to model and pretty easy to predict, which is based on just making power all the time. And that's sort of been the holy grail of renewable energy is how do we get to a point where we're really doing 24 hours a day of green power without having to have backups from natural gas or whatever. And so we started working on that challenge, and we realized that with our efficiencies, we can have a system that runs 16 hours a day and doesn't need a huge difference between that charge price and that discharge price because we don't have an efficiency loss and we're doing it every day. So we get lots of cycles per year to cover the cost of that system. And so we believe that we can do a system that's 8 hours a day of solar, 16 hours a day of our storage for less than 10 cents a kilowatt hour. That's about the cost that it takes for a new combined cycle gas turbine right now, according to the Lazard Frere levelized cost of energy report. So, and then the other thing that we add to that is we can have 84 hours of backup storage as well, all as part of that price. And so what that does for you is it covers those, right? Even in Arizona and California, it rains sometimes. And so with our system, because it's solar-based heat, we can't charge our system if it's raining. And so by having more than 3 days of backup storage, we can cover a lot of those days. So we think from our models that with that added backup storage, we could make that clean power about 90% of the hours of the year. And so Jigger Shaw was on the Energy Gang podcast a couple of weeks ago. He said that he would guess that right now, green firm power, like I'm talking about, is at least 15 cents a kilowatt hour. So we think that we can do that below 10. And we're just sort of getting started. So we're super excited about that idea. We're super excited about, we've already started talking to partners about how we can look at projects to do that. And we think that if we can pull that off, then that's hugely impactful.
Yeah, definitely. That's amazing to think about that at 10 cents per kilowatt hour, especially how much electricity is in the southwest of the United States, which is a little higher. And then also with electricity rates in the future, with EVs, obviously, crypto mining, like the price of energy is going to continue to increase. And so it's definitely, obviously, and you mentioned 14 to 15 cents for green technology. Like That's a huge competitive cost, just a lot cheaper than a lot of other alternatives or technologies
Hmm.
in the market, which is
Hmm.
really exciting. And it's interesting that you mentioned Jigar Shah because we had him on the Solar Maverick podcast recently, episode 49, and he was talking about VPPAs and that the DOE is actually providing a lot of money if you could create projects. And I would think, you mentioned obviously the 24/7 PPA in our discussions, that maybe there's an opportunity to apply within the DOE. Basically, you propose to the DOE like your technology could be beneficial for a VPPA. I don't know the exact,
Hmm.
but he talks about that.
I'm glad you raised that actually, because yeah, I mean, Jigar is really, he's an amazing guy. I was struck by that when he made that comment on that podcast. And so I just emailed him. And so it's one of the strange pieces of, life is that he lived for a while in the small town in Vermont that I live in, Norwich, Vermont. And we met at SPI back when it was still SPI, like 8 years ago or something like that. Had a chat about this cool little town in Vermont. But anyway, so I reached out to him on an email and I said, Jigger, I was struck by this comment. I think, yeah, I think that's right. I think we would estimate that at least 15 cents a kilowatt hour for technologies that are out in the market now. But we just made this proposal in this RFI for actually under 8 cents in that proposal. And so we had this back and forth over about a day. It's really amazing how generous he is with his, given everything he's got going on. But, our situation as a young startup is we're looking for investors who can invest in that first system, right?
Yeah.
And it's really hard to find folks that are willing to take that risk on a first system. And so I was asking, like, we're applying for grants when they come out if the question they're asking is pretty close to what we do, but there's no place in all of that DOE funding, right? Most of it, like the loan programs office that Trigger runs. And I think also in the VPP program, it's all focused on stuff that's early stage, but it's still deployed technology, stuff that people have built a couple of. And, I said, there's nowhere where you can go and propose a first of a kind system to be funded. And so the problem with, so there's the Office of the Clean Energy Demonstrations, great office, they got great funding, but they put out these periodic grant opportunities that are pretty narrowly focused, right? So there's a particular question they
Yes.
want to see answered. And so you got to look at it and you say, well, mine is not exactly that, but it's kind of like that. And I think you'll like what we're trying to do. So I'm going to go ahead and apply for that. And these are complicated applications. They take a lot of time from very small teams that don't have a lot of extra resources. So you put a lot into one of those applications and then you don't know the answer until, maybe 3 to 6 months later. So there's nothing really out there though, like I said, where you can just go and say, hey, we've got this thing that we think you guys should be really excited about. We think it checks a lot of boxes for people. Where can I go to get the money for that? So it's something we've talked to I was just in DC 2 weeks ago, the DOE over at the White House. And we talked about that exact thing. How can we set up a little bit of money that's set to fund first of a kind
Yeah.
systems?
So I don't know if you know about the solar prize because I thought that actually covered that, but I'm not sure, about the details because I haven't gone into, the US solar prize because that's usually like new technologies, but I'm
Mm.
not familiar with all the details regarding that. We've actually interviewed some of the companies that have won that award, and it's for relatively new technologies that, is early stage. So I think maybe that could be, but obviously, like I'm not an expert at that specifically, but
Yeah, I remember that prize and I can't remember the details of it. So that's a great recommendation. I'm gonna have to, as soon as I get done with our interview, I'm gonna have to look that up and see where they're at these days.
yeah, definitely. It's the US Solar Prize. It's to basically give grants for new clean energy technologies. They do it every year, and I think they announced the first recently, some of the winners, and one of the winners has reached out to be on the podcast.
Oh,
Yeah,
cool.
that's pretty interesting because like your technology is so innovative, and I think there's so much of a great application to it that we should have the grant programs easy. The complicated thing is, right? And John, you could totally understand this, is like it's great that there's so many incentives or grants, Department of Energy and other entities within the government that are trying to help. But sometimes it's really complicated for me to understand like what applies to what, just like you were talking
Hmm.
before, because I've looked at, because as a developer of solar projects, we've done some unique stuff in community solar and LMI and training related to
Hmm.
New York Housing Authority project. But it's hard sometimes to decipher all the project, all the opportunities, and it takes time. And it takes also too a lot of talking to obviously the different federal, agencies like the Department of Energy, obviously, and then also state agencies as well to really
Hmm.
understand that. Sometimes they create stuff, and this has happened before based on us commenting that there's a need in the market for it that
Yeah,
you're.
no, 100%. And then once you've understood it, right, then you need to explain it again to project funders and stuff like that and make sure that they're going to be comfortable, that they understand it the same way you do, and they're going to be willing to fund on that basis. That was actually an idea that we proposed at this meeting with the DOE was, one relatively straightforward way you could open up some funding for this would be to look at those tax credits and say, okay, you'll qualify for this credit, right? The ITC basically, if you turn on your system, right, and it makes the electricity, you qualify for your ITC more or less. And so for a first of a kind system, we'll give you a loan based on your expected ITC, right? So it's less funding required because you're going to get paid back some fraction of that, right? It's going to be
Yes.
a lower percentage because they're first of a kind systems and some of them aren't going to work out. But that way you can leverage that tax credit that's there to support that sort of project, right, in general. And so loan me the money that that tax credit is going to be worth to help pay for part of the construction of it. And then as long as it works, like I say, it's going to work and we turn on the system, we pay that back to you and you can give that to the next guy who has a good idea. And not that you would just have that available as a matter of right. You'd want to have some sort of application process so that you're not letting just anyone do that. Probably less onerous sort of application process than you would need for straight funding, for grant funding. So, I think that there are some ways to open this sort of stuff up that could really help stimulate some, because we're not the only guys out here, right? There are people
Oh, for
running all around this space, coming up with great ideas every single day. We keep running into them at these conferences where we're all pitching and stuff like that. And there's, really great technology being developed. And there's so many different use cases for energy storage, right? It's not going to be like one technology is going to figure it out for everyone. There's going to be seasonal storage that holds months worth of storage. There's going to be long duration stuff like we're talking about, and the batteries are going to continue to be valuable.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. Another interesting point that you mentioned that I totally agree with is, obviously you guys are small, entrepreneurial, and you have these applications and they take so much time to complete that there's also the labor constraint, right? Because you're doing a million different things. And then the applications are very intensive and take a lot of time and commitment. And then you have to wait a while before you actually hear back. I wonder whether there's a way of sort of streamlining these things to make it easier, especially for smaller companies that don't have the resources. And
Mm-hmm.
I've actually been on calls with the Department of Energy on how to expedite these processes or what are the resources to make it easier to find out whether what you're doing actually applies. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it's really like obviously having those contacts, like reaching out, like as you mentioned, John, to email Jigger and to get more clarity, you know what I mean? Because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's just hard from reading like the website and some of the things, whether you
Yeah,
qualify.
for sure. I mean, so like I said, Kent was developing this technology for about 5 years before we launched, and he just did that kind of on his own and at his own cost. When I joined, I was like, wow, it's really impressive that you bootstrapped, this
Yeah.
technology all the way through 3 patents. But then as we started developing and we started adding grant funding to one of our goals, there's a downside to that, right? So we're at the point now where sort of $200,000 grant to do an R&D piece is not particularly valuable to us because we're ready to build the first system, right? So we go and we do an application for a grant for like $1 million or $5 million. And then all of a sudden, these guys are like, well, who the heck are you? If you've gone down the path for a few years and they've been on that path with you, think that becomes an easier path in a lot of ways because they've gotten some base familiarity and comfort with the technology that you're developing, and they understand it better. There's a lot less room for confusion, and you can also then have some influence over what questions they ask for the next grant round, right? They know what you're trying to accomplish, so they write the grant in a way that they don't accidentally exclude you. And so all of those things for new companies, if I gave one piece of advice to an early technology company, it's go through the hassle of applying for a couple of $150,000, $250,000 grants, because that'll really pave the way nicely for when you want bigger grants.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And it's interesting too, because it sounds like Kent self-funded a lot of this stuff, which a lot of, other companies can't do that. So, which is a great problem actually to have, but then there is challenges with that based on what you said. So for sure. And then, obviously, John, you're a maverick yourself. You've been in the solar industry, renewable energy industry for a long time. It's interesting because really your background's a legal background. You got, your JD from NYU. I went to NYU as well, but in the business school. Can you talk about like your background and how you came to be a part of Photon Vault? I know you mentioned it before. Obviously, you and Kent, best friends, and you're working in a small startup environment as one of the founders, which is the first time you've done that. It would be great, for our audience to learn more about your background as you are the solar maverick, John.
So yeah, I'm an energy guy through and through. So I grew up in the oil patch, following my dad into the field as an exploration geologist. Got pictures of me sitting near oil wells as like an 8-year-old with my hard hat on. So I grew up that way. And then actually, before I even went to law school, I did policy work on energy in the state of Oklahoma, where Kent and I grew up. And then went to law school. My dad thought I was safely away from the oil and gas industry. I worked for a law firm in New York, but I worked for them in Australia, strangely. So that was super fun. But in that role, too, I worked for a lot of energy companies just because that's a big part of the economy down in Australia. And then we moved back to the States and I went in-house oil and gas company in Denver called Forest Oil. And they were mostly a gas company. And that was when I was fully all in on the gas as a bridge to the renewable future story, and I wanted to be part of that story. And so Forrest was doing great projects. I went in there as a lawyer, but about halfway through, I shifted over into business role. And it's funny, my friends from law school will get together from time to time, and we joke about how we've still not met anyone who says that they're a business person, but they're looking for an opportunity to break through to the legal side. Seems like there are lots of us in the legal department who are always looking for an opportunity to jump across to the business side. And I was successful in doing that. I got sent to Cape Town, South Africa to run the international business unit for us, and was there for about 4 years, which is super exciting and fun. And when I was there, I saw firsthand the development of the South African renewable energy program. At the time, it was the most ambitious, maybe still the most successful rollout of renewable energy programs in the developing world. And I got a really close view of that because the banker we were using on my project was very successful in getting projects approved in that first round. So at the same time, I had started to read articles from Professor Mark Johnson, who's a Stanford professor who basically is the main reason that we've now come to understand that the climate impact of methane emissions are actually in some ways worse than the CO2 emissions, right? And so as a result, natural gas is probably not a safe bet as a reliable bridge to a renewable. So with that knowledge, I pivoted and went into the solar business when I moved back to the States. So helped to develop two solar energy developers now. The first one was a small one called Norwich Technologies that's here where I live in Vermont. So there I think I was also employee number 8 there. So I wasn't part of the founding team, but I was part of the first group of people that came on board and helped to commercialize them. They developed some technology through Dartmouth, which is right nearby here. And they're still going strong, doing great C&I projects here in Vermont. and in Maine, and I think a little bit in Massachusetts now. And then I joined Ian Palmer and Matt Hankey, New Energy Equity, down in Annapolis, Maryland. And so there too, I think I was employee number 8. Again, not part of the founding team, but early on. And I was VP of Business Development and General Counsel there. So again, splitting that role of legal and business. And, I can't say enough about New Energy Equity. I think that Matt and Ian built, one of the teams that can claim to be the best CNI team in the business. They're all super impressive, but they're also super fun and motivated people who are really, they look forward to coming in every day, doing more projects. So it was a really fun place to be.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting actually to hear your background. And I think it's great to actually be a lawyer. It's interesting for me because like I feel like I'm a lawyer now. All I read is like legal documents and provide comments and business points. I was debating between being a lawyer and or going into business or getting my MBA. And, I think it's a great foundation. And then like incorporating the business aspect of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's what's funny. Matt Hankey, CEO at New Energy Equity, he used to tell me that maybe after he's done with New Energy Equity, he thinks he might go to law school just for fun. And I said, wow, I can't advise you more strongly against you
I
right now,
guess.
but
Yeah.
whatever. But it is a really valuable skill to have for sure. You think about things a little bit differently as a lawyer. Sometimes, if you're lucky, can see traps lying ahead that might not occur to you otherwise. And as Al Pacino said in The Devil's Advocate, it's like the ultimate backstage pass. The lawyers get to see how all the sausage is made and then where all the bodies are buried. There's some excitement that way too.
I actually would go back to school for fun to get an electrical engineering degree, not a legal degree.
Yeah.
I just think I mean, now I feel like I'm a technical person because like really involved in the details, but I think that would be helpful. And by the way, I have a actually funny story about Matt. I actually knew him when he worked at Standard Solar. I actually got a job offer to be his replacement when he left. And then I actually took a job at Tesla instead. So it's pretty
Okay.
funny. He starts New Energy Equity, and obviously New Energy Equity, as you said, is like one of the biggest investors out there in the commercial industrial community solar space in the US.
Yeah, he's really done great with that team. And yeah, but it shows you what a small industry we still are, right? Which is also part of the fun. I was just in Chicago this week at the solar conference out there. Yeah, you see all these people that you've now built a career around, and you see the same folks on deals or in different markets as you're scrambling to build new markets together. And it's fun to be in an industry where the pie keeps growing, right? Everybody's a fierce competitor. Everybody wants to win a given project, but there's still camaraderie and friendliness that is easier to maintain when you know that there's enough for everyone out there.
Oh, yeah. And I think here's a great point. It's all about relationships in business, right? It's a small industry. Like I'm still working with people like that I worked with at Tesla or some of the other solar and renewable energy companies, just because like we've had a good relationship and I know how they work. And, if there's like some way we could add value together, I would, prefer to work with someone that I've had with the past. And, there are a lot of new players too out there in the industry too. And usually like I will know someone who's worked with that party. And usually I'll try to get some information about how that person is or how that company is through people that in the past. First it could be on the same company or maybe we've done prior deals together. It's interesting that I think like even after all these years, like I'm sometimes working a lot with the same people that I have for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, for better and worse, right? Like, there's nowhere to hide your mistakes. But on the good side, those relationships are, really long lasting. We have 8 of our investors at Photon Vault are people that were related to New Energy Equity somehow, either some of the founders or others involved. Another is someone that I worked side by side with when I was at the oil company. We have a long work history together. It's just really cool when you can be in a new chapter of your life and you're able to bring some of the people from the last chapter or 3 chapters ago and have them be part of that again and get a chance to work alongside them again and just keep going down that path together.
Yeah, and then what I was going to say, relationships that are scalable, right? Because there's that
Mm,
trust factor and you're able to close things and do things faster. So, versus like a brand new party that you don't have any
for sure.
experience that as well. Because trust and, transparency is just so important and having that experience working with like-minded people. So,
Exactly.
as you know, like the Solar Maverick podcast is about solar and entrepreneurship. You've actually provided a lot of perspective. Like, what have you learned for working with this is almost like your third startup. Like, if you could give one sort of thing that you've learned that you think would be helpful for our listeners who we call Mavericks.
Yeah, I think probably the single biggest thing is capacity management and prioritization, right? So, and this is true for both startups, but then also like early stage companies like Norwich was and New Energy when I joined them. You just never are going to have enough time. You're never going to have enough people, and you're never going to have enough money. There are all these things, in some sense, need to be done, and you're just not going to get all of them done. It's just not going to happen. And so you need to figure out among those which ones you're going to actually do. And that's in the grand scale as you're thinking strategically about, the next 18 months, 3 years, whatever. And it's true of the like, what am I going to do today? It's one of the things that I think is difficult sometimes, like for lawyers, for example. You work with an outside lawyer, you give them a question, every aspect of that question is going to have been analyzed and documented and written up for you. And your bill is going to reflect that fact because that's their model, right? Their model is to prioritize completeness over efficiency. And so, the single worst thing for them is to do all that work and get the wrong answer, right? They never want to be in the position where they get it wrong. And so they're incredibly thorough and they go through. But you can't do that every time a question comes up when you're a startup. You've got to be able to rely on your instincts. You've got to be able to rely on your experience, and you've got to be able to rely on your ability to assess the importance of any given thing and say, okay, this one we can wait till tomorrow, or this one we actually can just wait and doesn't have to happen. And that's really hard and sort of constantly have to go back and re-examine whether you think that you made the right call on that so that next time it comes up, you can evolve with that. But I think that's the single hardest thing.
Yeah, that is a great point, and you explained that succinctly. What also advice do you have? Like, obviously, a lot of startup companies go through fundraising. You mentioned earlier in the podcast, like Photon Volt, raised $3.5 million. What like advice would you have? Most entrepreneurs do have to go out there and fundraise.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's been new for me. So that's one of the differences between being in the first wave of people getting hired versus being on the founding team. So I managed the fundraising with our CFO, Andrew Clark. It was all new for me. So, I've probably given over 200 pitches now in the last 2 years since doing that. We've had some great success and have a great team of investors, but man, it was a learning curve for sure. I think one thing is that you can't ever take it personally, right? So you're in one of these conversations, someone basically tells you, yeah, you're stupid, this isn't going to work, right? You can get offended by that and you can start an argument, but I guarantee no one's going to write you a check at the end of an argument, right? Or you can take that as an opportunity to, tell your story, right? You can, oh, yeah, no, I definitely understand why you're saying that. We think that we've addressed that challenge. Here's how we addressed it. Here's why I think that that's not going to trip us up, right? But every time you get rejected, you have to remind yourself that it's not you getting rejected. They just simply are not choosing to write you a check. And they're hearing from people all the time, every day, lots of great ideas out there. And so everything sort of needs to fit together before someone's going to say yes and write that check. So you need to be comfortable hearing the no, but also I think it's important to be greedy about asking for feedback from people. So some people sort of as a general course, they don't give any feedback. They just say, thanks, but we're going to pass. That's fine. But others, if you ask them, they'll take a little bit of time and they'll explain to you why they're not going to move forward. Sometimes that feedback will include things, if you had done it differently, might have changed the outcome with them. And sometimes not. Sometimes it's just that you're in the wrong space for where they're wanting to make their investment, stuff like that. But those generous people that are happy to give you feedback. You can do that just by practicing your pitch with some friendly audiences, right? Friends of yours that are entrepreneurs or investors, things like that, that'll give you that honest feedback that a friend will give you that maybe a stranger won't. It's just super valuable. And then another is to really spend a little bit of time getting to know who you're going to be delivering your pitch to. You've made some connections successfully. Maybe someone's introduced you to the person. Maybe you succeeded with a cold call, but then dig in there and figure out who you're really going to be talking to about them, about their firm, why you think that they would be a good fit, not just because they have money to give you. If money is the only thing that you see someone being able to contribute to you, it's probably not a good fit for you. People have so much more to offer than their dollars. I'm super excited about the success we've had in bringing people with experience that's directly relevant to what we're wanting to do, that I can call up and I can ask questions that'll take time to give me frank advice. Just so much more than the value of the dollars.
I totally agree. That's been amazing advice, especially getting feedback too. I found that really helpful. Obviously not taking anything personally. John, I really appreciate this. Has been an amazing interview. I appreciate you making time. How could our audience learn more about you and Photon Volt?
Yeah, you can follow us on LinkedIn and reach out to either me or the company has its own LinkedIn profile as well. Our website is an evolving asset, but there's some great information on that as well at photonvault.com. And then Kent and I personally are very accessible. We love to hear from people. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or send me a direct email. That's jlangus at photonvault.com. So JLANGHUS at photonvault. There's lots of ways to reach me. I'm always excited to talk to people. Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to get to talk with you today, Benoit.
Anytime. I think this was an amazing interview. We will have all the notes of how to contact you and Photon Volt's website on the notes of the podcast. I appreciate everything that you're doing, John, and I'm excited to, see the progress over time, especially once you start commercializing the technology. And I really do believe it could be a game changer for the industry.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to add some of these photon vaults to your community solar project.
Definitely would love to. I know we talked about that when we last hung out in San Diego. I definitely would love to figure out how to collaborate together on that. I'm really excited about your technology.
Awesome.
Thank you again, John.
All right. Take care, man.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick Podcast. The Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Renew Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@renewenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick Podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoit Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.